Welcome back to Machine Translation. Today's lecture is about analysis and visualization. So we're going to visit a lot of topics that are around the questions about how do we know how well our machine translation system works, what kind of mistakes does it make, can we get a better sense of characterizing these mistakes, but also looking at what is actually going on inside these neural models that we built that are a bit hard to understand. So there's various efforts on the way to visualize the internals of these models, and the ultimate goal is one big name for that is explainable AI, machine translation, machine learning, artificial intelligence that not only gives more accurate predictions, but can also give the reasons for these predictions. Let's first look at analytical evaluation. So this looks at evaluation again, but more with a focus on what kind of mistakes does a machine translation system make. So this all falls under the category of error analysis. So the idea is basically to manually inspect the output of a machine translation system and then identify errors and categorizing them. That's probably the first step. Another step then further down the road might be to automate this process somehow. But very often we just basically do a very manual process of errors and their categories. For instance, we notice that neural machine translation has specific problems that previous generations of machine translation didn't have. It might just completely drop some output or add some output that is not in the source. It also has a particular type of gibberish as it produces, like repeating a word over and over again or repeating a phrase over and over again. It seems to be sometimes caught in a loop. And the most mysterious and interesting is just to hallucinate output, to just produce output that has absolutely nothing to do with input. This happens very often in low resource scenarios or when confronted with out of domain input, as we already mentioned in a previous lecture. So here's an example of hallucinated output. So these are examples of extreme translation failure. So we had already on a previous lecture where we looked at challenges, this example of a low resource. So we train a machine translation system, here an English, Spanish machine translation system on just insufficient amount of training data. And so the sentence, the Republican strategy to counter the re-election of Obama, was then translated into something that just has nothing to do with the input. Even if you don't know Spanish, you see words like organ, announcement, free determination. None of this has very much to do with the input. Here's another example where we built a machine translation system on medical publications of the European Medical Association, and we fed it some input that comes from a subtitle corpus, and then it was completely lost with that. It had never seen words like this. I think the word dich and shower were completely unknown in this corpus. One is an imperative, and the other one is a very formal way of saying you, informal way of saying you that just doesn't happen in kind of official publication, and it just stutters and produces this completely unrelated output. So this is a very unique characteristic of neural MT of going completely off track in this way. It basically just turns into a generative language model that just kind of spews things that are maybe vaguely related to the input, maybe just completely ignores the input context. Here's a more traditional view of error categories that were proposed. They're often very linguistically motivated. So this is a very influential paper by David Villar where he proposed this error category. So, but everybody who kind of sits down and comes up with error categories tends to come up with something very similar to this. So what kind of errors does a machine translation system do? Well, what is the first thing you can notice? You can say that certain words are missing. There should have been translations of words that are not there. And then you can make a distinction between content words. and what he calls here filler words, which might more call function words. Then we can observe problems with word order, and then you can say that are they just individual words or whole phrases reordered, and is it just like a very local misordering, or is the word just completely out of place? Um, then there's this broad character of incorrect words, which, the predominant, the one that we think of first is word sense. So it's just the wrong lexical choice, and incorrect disambiguation. I don't even know anymore what the difference between those two things is. Maybe one is it's just that is, a valid translation of the word, but it's not the right one here, while this one is just a completely unconnected word. Incorrect forms, so this has a lot to do with morphology, where some of the morphological information is just wrong. Extra words, style, and mistranslation of idioms. And then unknown words is another big category that's easy to spot. So if it has an input word and just doesn't know what to do with it, and is it just copied in the target or dropped or just completely mistranslated? And then you can also check is that it's just that word stem. If you deprive it of its morphological inflection, is that unseen in the training data, or is this particular inflected form of the word unseen in the training data? And then punctuation. So it's kind of interesting if you just really drill down. So some requires you to know something about the training data. So is it an unknown word? Well, that means knowing what is known in the training data. Some are very fine-grained linguistic distinctions between content words, so the nouns, verbs, adjectives, adverbs, and the function words. Some require some sense of like what is a incorrect meaning of a word that was falsely detected, or did it just completely pick the wrong word? Some vague notions of long distance and large distance. So you see, these are not super straight categories of errors, and they're very hard to follow. And basically every human studies that applies something like this has to wrestle with that different annotators just use these kind of categories in very, very different ways. So one way to address this is to just say, well, that's just how it is. Let's just get a lot of annotators and just take that as face value. Another strategy is to actually train them and then maybe have more reliable judgment. Here's another idea just across the same lines that currently becomes more influential called MQM. Um, so some machine translation quality metrics, which follows very similar things. So it kind of makes a clear distinction between accuracy, wrong word translations, either by adding or dropping or mistranslating or just untranslated. So these are words that are just copied in the output. And then there's fluency. And that can be then more like this is a monolingual language problem. So there's a grammar error, a grammar register, and so on and so on. And then also other categories that are beyond these two things. So style, is it just, it has the right meaning, but it just doesn't hit quite the same note. Are there particular problems with terminology? And so on and so on. Nuance about that, yes, this might be acceptable sentence in American English, but not in British English and things like that. So here is a study that actually compared neural machine translation errors and statistical machine translation errors. So the main thing that we're looking at here is called phrase-based syntactic. Phrase-based statistical system. They also had a hierarchical system, which we didn't discuss much in class, and syntax-based system, which I hinted on several times, but which we also didn't really discuss in class. So the mainstream technology was phrase-based, and this is 2016, where NeuralMT just kind of showed up on the scene. And they looked at the different error categories. This study is not very interesting because for whatever reason, the neural machine translation system just seems to be generally much, much better than the phrase-based in this particular study, so the total number of errors got cut in half. Um, and so it's less interesting to see what what they did here. The way they do this is as a byproduct of a machine translation evaluation competition, where the evaluation was to manually correct the machine translation output and then count how many corrections were done. As a byproduct of this, we basically have a list of word edits. So what did the translator actually do? And they kind of broke it down by how often did I change a verb, how much did I change a pronoun, and so on and so on. And you see here, for instance, that in the phrase-based, they changed 116 words, and the neural, they've only changed 35 words. While in terms of determiners, that didn't really change much at all. Okay, so let's look at another way to do this kind of evaluation. And maybe I should conclude. All this is somewhat informative. You have a very big impact of the annotator doing it. As you might remember, our first homework assignment was kind of in line with doing something like this. Can you tell us what is wrong with machine translation? And the typical thing that most of you did was to kind of come up with some linguistically motivated error categories. So it's a very informative thing to do. And I think it's always frequently just useful to just do it, even if in terms of quantitative results, it's a bit hard to kind of get anything that is reliable and holds up across annotators or even between annotators or over time. But it does give you as a person doing it a much better insight about kind of what mistakes are being made. Let's look at the next topic, which is targeted test sets. So this is basically taking kind of the motivation for what we did so far, which was, can we nail down what kind of mistakes are being made, but do it in an automatic fashion. So here is the idea. So can we create a certain challenge set where we then figure out how does the machine translation system deal with this? So here is a specific problem. You know, there is here about particular calls that should have. So the subject-verb agreement is here, and in the translation, it might also be distant. And we're translating here into French apparently, where the subject, where the verb is more heavily inflected, and this being a plural noun has always an impact on what verb form is being chosen. Here is the translation that the system came up with. And then in the this is the reference translation of what it should have picked as a translation of the word should. And here's what the machine translation system came up with. And it just shows you checks, is the subject-verb agreement correct or not? So basically constructing a challenge set of a few sentences where particular problems are being kind of highlighted, or particular problems are a bit harder to solve for machine translation system. For instance, subject-verb agreement is harder to solve if these words are not right next to each other. And then checking manually again, did they do the right thing? Here are results they did for comparing neural MT and phrase-based MT. You can see already there are very, very few examples overall, and you can see how often it did get things right and wrong. And often you see a change from 0% to 100% or something similar, or just no change at all. In this study, the authors were pleasantly surprised about how much a neural machine translation improved. So here's another way to do this along those lines that you can actually automate. So this is the idea of contrastive translation pairs. So you basically, again, want to find out how well certain translation problems are handled. And again, these are the kind of linguistically motivated categories like noun phrase agreement, subject verb agreement, subject verbal particle, polarity, negative and positive. You see a lot of these are really fluency problems, while this one is more an adequacy problem. So the idea here is now with Neural MT, you can score any possible output translation. So you can, if you put in an input sentence and connect it up and propose yourself a possible output sentence, you can get the neural machine translation system to score that translation. So the idea now is to basically let the neural machine translation system score the correct translation, but then also create a negative example where that correct translation is modified to introduce a particular error of the kind of categories that we talked about. So, and then ultimately the question is, check if the positive example gets a better score. So here's some examples. So noun phrase agreement. So these interesting proposals, that's something that was taken from the reference translation. And then the thing idea is to, okay, we'll keep proposals. There's probably enough semantic clues to get that word right, but let's change this here to this. Here's subject-verb agreement. So the idea to extend voting rights was, and this is a particular hard example because you have was directly following a plural noun, so rights was from a bigram language model would say, nope, that's wrong. And that's exactly the thing that we modify here. And here's another one, switch the light on, switch the light by. So here's a study from 2017 that compares, again, neural machine translation systems for English, German. The way they basically examine things is they focus on different ways of encoding words, either byte pair encoding or character-based word embedding models. And with the hope that character-based word embedding models might do better with morphology because they have a more general notion of how inflected forms are being formed because it looks at actually the character sequence. And here it checks then how often one system or the other system gets things right. So if we just drill down on the numbers, although they don't really matter so much. So here's what a human would. I also ask humans, what do you prefer? And humans always seem to be almost always, but not always, spot the error. And here is the BPE model. That's kind of the standard model that is being used throughout most of machine translation, which also here seems to perform better, while they have these BPE to character models, which does seem to be doing better in some categories. Interestingly, somewhat really unrelated to character, which is the insertion of polarity. Here's another way to check the power of a neural machine translation system by creating artificial training data and to see how well they can handle certain things. So for instance, you can ask how well can it deal with kind of these bracketed structures. So these happen in natural language a lot when you have kind of nested constructions like relative clauses in the middle of a sentence. So the man who I met yesterday bought a book. So you basically have to start with a sentence that is the man, and then you insert the subphrase who I met yesterday, and then you have to continue with bought a book, just to kind of give a sense of what these bracketed structures mean in natural language. So if you feed it things like this, you can then check how well can a model make correct predictions based on nesting depth, length, so how deeply nested constructions can the neural machine translation or just the neural language model actually still properly decipher. Okay, let's move on to another topic. So this is not now looking so much at errors, but just looking at what is happening in these models. How does it make predictions? What do we do? What do we see? We already had like this visualization, which is a very compelling and useful visualization, which is the attention mechanism in a neural machine translation system based on recurrent neural networks. And you can basically say whenever a word prediction is being made, what is being paid attention to. So when it made here this prediction of the word Netanyahu, what it paid attention to, it paid attention to Netanyahu. While when it made this prediction of the word Zeit, it paid attention to, well, the word for, which is actually the most kind of relevant one, but it also paid quite a bit of attention on other words. And at the end here, it seems to be paying kind of some random attention to other stuff. Here's how it looks like in multi-head attention. So this is now moving to the transformer-based models where you have multiple attention heads, and then each attention head might look at different things. So again, we are predicting a word here, predicting the word making. So we're now translating in this direction. We're predicting a word here, and or actually this is self-attention, and we basically check on what previous words in the encoder layer does it pay attention to. And yeah, one attention head is really just kind of copying the information from the previous layer, while other attention heads do look at more kind of context words that help to disambiguate the meaning of these words. So making is a very interesting word because it really is so broad in meaning and could mean anything. But here we talk about making something more difficult. So making something more difficult, you could maybe think of a verb that that captures that meaning more directly, but clearly you have to disambiguate making more finely. So let's just say you translate to a language which doesn't have this construction of making more difficult, but has a verb that has exactly that meaning. I can't think of an English word, but difficult ties. Maybe there's a word like that in other languages. So it's helpful to then be more clear about what making here means in this particular sentence. And by looking at multi-head attention, this is what you get. So you see a little bit the problem that, you have multiple heads and they pay attention to different things and different heads to different stuff. Here is another example that they had actually in their original paper on transformer, the transformer model, where they just looked at how attention is being kind of processed. And this is now looking at just one of the attention heads. And here is the comment. Here, many of the attention heads exhibit behavior that seems to be related to the structure of the sentence. Another visualization that we do is already encountered was looking at word embeddings. So we can draw these pretty pictures and saying like, yeah, this looks right. It's doing kind of the right thing. It groups the right words next to each other. These are all the words that kind of are semantically related. Isn't that amazing? Here's an interesting thing, a study we did where we looked at the meaning of the word right, which might mean all kinds of things. So we're hinting at it here. Here's political, so more conservative. There is, well, privilege is not a good word replacement, but you get like the legal right to do something or the moral right to do something. Then there's the directions, like going to the right direction versus left direction, right in the sense of correct, and then immediately like right here, or I'll get right on it. And if you break down the words by these word senses, so you label them verb senses and look at then contextualized word embeddings and check where they end up, you kind of see fairly nice clusters. So the blue stuff, so the right here ends up here, while directional sense, the yellow one is kind of more here, and so on. So that's interesting too. So how well, that way you can check how well do certain layers in your processing in the encoder are they actually doing word sense disambiguation? Clearly, at some point, the meaning of the word right has to be disambiguated. And we suspect that a lot of that happens in the encoder. And here we can check how often this actually happens in at least the categories of word senses that we as humans might find reasonable. Let's look at another question we might ask. which is, if you remember when we make word predictions, so when we make this prediction of the output word here, it is informed by two very different things. One is the input context, so what is in the source sentence that it lets us to predict the next word, but it's also influenced by the previous output, so it's the decoder state. And a fair question is to ask about is how much does each contribute? So when is the decision more driven by the previous decoder state? So how much is it just kind of a language model generation activity, and how much is it driven by the input context? So this is a question we explored a little bit in prior work, where we looked at the difference between the prediction of a neural machine translation model and the prediction of just a pure language model. And if you just look at the difference between the prediction of the two, so the one way to measure the difference between two probability distributions is the KL divergence. We get this visualization here. So whenever this chart here is high, that means the KL diversion between the decoder prediction and decoder prediction without any input context, so essentially a language model, how much they differ. And if they differ a lot, then obviously the input mattered a lot. And you see here, so one thing that we suspected and that was borne out here is that function words are not so much driven by the input context, but content words are, especially names. But you also see that here is a word that was broken up in byte pair encoding. The second part seems to be just purely follow from the decoder state, and the input context doesn't matter so much here anymore. Okay, with this in mind, maybe there are other visualizations we could do, and so there's some interesting development of visualization tools. So we really would like to, whenever a machine translation system, especially if it makes a mistake, we would like to say what happened here, what did it do, how did it come up with this decision, what led it, what did it see in the training data, and all these kind of things. So here two examples of these tools where they were published in papers. So here's one tool that visualizes, first of all, the search graph. So this is, for instance, like what did it actually consider during prediction? And this is basically all the hypotheses that ended up being generated and picked as kind of the top 5 or whatever the beam size is of hypotheses that are maintained during search, and what other predictions were made. So for instance here, it started out and could say in by the, and then in a lot of paths were followed here, but another strong path apparently that ultimately led to the best translation went this way. And here you can then click on a particular point. So you can actually click on this word here, scientist, and see what happened here. So it had the prediction of where would that probability successfully first made, and so on and so on. So this is a nice visualization of the search graph. This particular tool also allows you to figure out what happens if you do things differently. For instance, if you change the attention weights somehow, how does it come up with different translations? And see how that impacts then word translation. So for instance, that allows you to explore how much attention matters when predictions are being made. Here's another way to visualize what is happening. So these are, it's a visualization of the attention weights here. So whenever it predicted a word, what did it pay attention to? And then on that's here in this line, and then here the other visualization is the visualization of the probability distribution of what it predicted. Here's an interesting thing is looking at the decoder state, and now we are plotting that into a 2D graph and then figure out where in the kind of space of all possible decoder states do states occur. and we basically then put in the decoder states of the actual translation, and we can also then compare it against decoder states seen during training. So whenever we run training, we basically run the same thing. We also ran a forward prediction, and at each point we had a decoder state. So is this similar to something that's been seen in training? So here is basically translation. So it starts here. Um, this at the same, I think it starts at the other end. Sorry, that's the end of a sentence. Now I'm trying to find it. In Berlin, and so on. And then at the end here with at the same time. The interesting thing is that you can, when it makes a particular prediction, like he, yeah, the word he is here, and then you can look at like what are the surrounding kind of decoder states seen in training, and is there something interesting to say there? So you can also look at neighborhood, like how big is a neighborhood? Are there a lot of similar states? That might indicate that that's a more reliable point, but also what other predictions are being made. So this is what's indicated here. So it looks at this particular neighborhood of states, and our current model makes there's now a prediction that's being made, and then what other predictions are being made in this context. So the word rich, dark, 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 darkness, dark, dark, dark. So a lot of these places, similar decoder states, it makes the prediction of the word dark. Okay, here's another angle at visualization, which now looks at probing. So here's a bit of a question of what is actually being represented in the representations we have. What is contained in all these intermediate representations? So we start out with input words, and at the end we have output words, and then we have various levels of intermediate representations. So we start out with word embeddings, which we already looked at quite a lot. And then we have encoder states and decoder states. And what information is in there? Like what can we figure out what is actually being stored there? And people mostly go about this from a more linguistic point of view, where they say, does it discover morphological properties? Where does the model do word sense disambiguation? We already looked at that a little bit. And here the idea is to pose this as a clear question. So the question is, the decoder states discover part of speech somehow. Let's say, do the decoder, that's the encoder, discover part of speech? Does it at some point have some representation where all the nouns have similar vectors, at least in some of the elements of the vector are kind of indicating this is a noun, and some other, if they had different values, this would indicate it's a verb. Is that the case? Can basically are actually part of speech somehow being discovered by the encoder? So how can we test this? So the way we could test this is to basically formalize this as a classification problem. So we're giving an encoder state, for instance, the word dog in a particular sentence, and we know it's a noun. And can we, from the encoder state, predict that it's a noun? So, for instance, we couldn't do this from just word embeddings, because any word that has multiple possible part of speech, like could be both a verb and a noun, we can it's always the same embedding, so we can't predict from it if it's a verb and a noun. But the encoder state looks at the surrounding context, and then it should be able to figure out, is this word being used here in this particular sentence as a verb and a noun? And can we now predict from the encoder state that, for instance, the word dog here is a noun? So we can train this on basically just running inference on a bunch of sentences, run part of speech tagging on the input, and then figure out does it actually make these predictions. So we translate some sentences not seen during training, we record the encoder states, we also know they're part of speech, so we run on part of speech tagger on the input, sentence or actually translate label data that is already labeled for part of speech. And that gives you a bunch of training examples of encoder state and label. So that allows you to build a classifier and then you can check how well it does. So here's one way how this is being done. So you have here the encoder state. Now this is at layer 2. This is the encoder state at layer 2 for the word herself. And then you basically try to predict two different things. One is what we talked about so far. Can we predict that's a pronoun? So as a classifier, you use a feed-forward neural network. And here's another classifier where we have a bit more fine-grained or more semantically informed tags. So here, semantic tagging for pronouns. For instance, what I know is a reflexive pronoun. Again, that's a different classifier then that makes these predictions. So here's one such study. So here the authors looked at a neural machine translation model based on LSTM cells without attention and checked how well it can handle several tasks. So one task is the kind of task we mostly care about, translation. So they checked how translating English into Russian and English into German. Another task was to just copy the English. And another task is basically shuffling up the English sentence, provide that as an output, and then copy that as input and output, and then copy that. Another one is to parse English into linearized parse structure. So this is basically producing output in the form of sentence, noun phrase, the dog. So these kind of bracketed structures that we discussed at some point. So with that, can we predict from the encoder states properties such as is this word part of a constituent phrase? Is it the beginning of a constituent phrase? Basically, can we predict these labels? Another one was, is it a passive or an active voiced sentence? And another one is it a past tense or present tense sentence? So these are the things that they try to predict. They pose these different tasks because the question is, does it learn more about the English? Does it have to discover more about the English when it translates than when it just does simpler tasks like copying it? And they did find that these predictions were done much higher level of quality when translating. So the comparison here is always the majority class, like what's the more common thing. So most sentences are active voice. So if you just always guess active voice, that's majority class. So how much better do you do with that? So for when you do translation, they obtain much better quality with a classifier. But if they just do copying, they have the same quality as the majority class. Here's the other study that looked at things like does it discover part of speech tags? Does it discover semantic tags? And so one interesting finding here is that they looked at the different encoder layers. So they looked at the first layer, the second layer, third layer, and basically checked, does it discover different things at different times? And they did find, obviously, and not surprisingly, that they have better performance at deeper layers. And when they do this, it doesn't really matter what target language you have. So if you translate from English to German, English to French, English to Russian, English to Chinese, it always discovers similar things about English. So it's not so much driven by the output language. In another examination, they basically try to figure out if character-based word embeddings are more helpful to deal with morphology, especially for morphologically rich languages. Again, they try to make predictions for part of speech and morphological properties. And here are some of the findings. So character-based representations are much better for learning morphology. Word-based models are sufficient for learning structure of common words. Lower layers are better at word structure, deeper layers are better at word meaning. Target language matters for what information is learned, and that the neural decoder learns very little about word structure. So if you do this on the decoder states, you don't get this kind of information out. So let's look at another kind of visualization analysis question where we're going to look at several methods. The first method we look at is relevance propagation. So here is the question: when the model makes a particular prediction, what drives that prediction? So we've already hinted at that earlier where we looked at encoder state versus decoder state. What is this prediction informed by the input, or is it informed by the previous words? And here's another method that really tries to figure out, when it makes prediction, what inputs let it make this prediction. So what is in the input, which might not be the input sentence, or it might also be the previously produced words. What drove it to this decision? So the first method we're going to look at is relevance propagation. So what part of the network has the biggest impact for the final decision of predicting a particular word? So machine translation, this means prediction of a specific output words, and then the question is which of the input words matter the most and which of the previous output words matter the most. So we start here with the output prediction, so what the high value that's given for the word in the softmax, and then compute backwards what contributed to this high value. So the first step is consider the values of the previous layer and consider the weights of the previous layer, and basically then figure out, based on these values and weights, what actually led to the high value that was computed there. So we're gonna basically keep doing this throughout the layers. So basically try to figure out like what led to this large number that is being computed there. So here's an example of what happened. So here the word York is predicted, and the question is what drove it to make this particular prediction. So which of the previous input words here mattered, the previous output words mattered, and which of the input words mattered. And this is here in color highlighting what kind of drove this decision. So the decision was mostly predicted by the previous word new. The capitalized new obviously is a pretty strong indicator that the word York follows, but also here the Chinese input word. Let's look at another method that tries to find out what impacts the decisions that are being made and trace it back to the inputs. It's called Saliency, and it was originally developed for vision. The intuition here is if a decision changes a lot, if a specific input value changes, then it's more relevant. So input values whose changes make a difference are probably important. While if a change in the input value has no impact on the decision, then it's not relevant. So mathematically, we're going to look at the relationship here between an output value y and an input value x. So if you just assume this to be a linear relationship, which is approximately true locally, then we can compute the slope of this relationship. And this says if it's a very steep slope, then yes, the input value x has a big impact on y. And if it's flat, then the changes in the input value x have no impact on the decision y. So if you consider the slope here, well, that's just basically brings us back to computing derivatives, which we're already doing a lot in neural learning. So we just look at the derivative of y given x with respect to x. So let's look at an example where we can actually test this out. So which input word has the most influence on an output word prediction? So we try to trace this back to word embeddings. Some technical note here. So we're not interested here in individual neurons, although we might be in other applications of this method. So since we're not interested in individual neurons, we're going to combine the saliency values in an embedding vector. So here's an example how well this actually works. This is now in a transformer model where the attention mechanism, even if you somehow average it out over multiple attention heads, is less kind of indicative of word alignment. So on the left, we see how words are connected up in a human reference word alignment. So let's just look at the example of the word "we" here, which translates into "wir" in German, and that's how it is marked up in the word alignment. This is what the attention mechanism does. So it not only includes the word "we," but also includes the word "that." So it's not as accurate, while the saliency method here gets this right. It also gets other things right. For instance, that the word "das" here is connected to "that," which here is missing, and here the saliency method gets right. So one a little bit protracted problem with all these interpretability measures is we can develop these methods and then we don't really know if they really tell us the right thing. Are they really revealing what the model is doing? And there's also a difference between what a model should be doing, which we kind of assumed here in the word alignments. We assumed, oh, this is the human word alignment, and any method that kind of reveals behavior of the model that matches this human word alignment is a good method. But that is what a model should be doing. And it's not necessarily what a model is doing. Especially if the model makes mistakes, then the model is obviously doing something wrong, and maybe that is because it pays attention to the wrong inputs. Maybe it is something else. So, and also in our example where we seem to have some ground truth of what a model should be doing, well, the impact of an input word is not exactly the same thing as a word alignment. So if we look at the production of the German word Bank, well, probably the English word bank and the English sentence is probably the most responsible one to producing it. But there are also other words that might be crucial for word sense estimation. So maybe the decision to produce this German word bank is also driven by having the word credit and account in the input sentence, because that really then reveals the right meaning for the word, and somehow obviously that has impact on making these translation decisions. And even more than that, that the word bank here is a noun, for instance, is also something that matters. And what leads the model to determine that it's a noun and, for instance, not a verb, or maybe surrounding words to the word bank. So that also has impact on that. And that's all the things that go into the decision. So it's not as simple as kind of the one connected word that matters the most. So all this falls under the big umbrella term of explainable AI. So an important question for users of AI methods, natural language processing tools, is why did the network reach this decision? And we would really like to be able to trace back decisions to inputs. So we want to come up with a causal explanation where the model says, I produced this word because I've seen this in the input, or because I've seen this and that in the training data. The last thing we want to look at is actually looking at the neural model itself. It consists of a bunch of numbers. We have millions and millions of numbers, and why don't we just look at them and see, can we actually observe something interesting there? Here's a study which looked at actually just individual neurons. So if you look at the 500 dimensional representations that we usually deal with, or 1,000 or 2,000 dimensional representations, look at one of these dimensions and see what happens. So this is a character-based language model, and we look at one neuron and look at the value of it. So this is an interesting neuron here. So it seems to be strongly activated first and then kind of goes down in the value, indicated by color, and then there's a line break. So this seems to be something that predicts kind of here the end of sentence token or end of line token. Here's another neuron that seems to be triggered by quotes. So it gets turned on when it sees an opening quote, and then it gets turned off if it sees a closing quote. And then down here you see there's another opening quote and gets turned on there as well. However, here's another example. First of all, there's another example of where you run this over computer code, where you also see these kind of parenthesis structures being kind of triggered. But however, obviously, large portion of cells are not easily interpretable. So a lot of the neurons, if you look at them, and there is not really any clear pattern that can be observed. So that opens up the questions about like how are actually specific properties encoded? Is it really just a single neuron? That would be the easiest case. And if it is a single neuron, can we find it? So we can basically ask particular questions. For instance, is the length of the sentence encoded somewhere? So especially look at recurrent neural networks, when it produces output, it kind of has to figure out how long of a sentence it has to generate. So it needs to have some sense of length and saying, okay, the sentence is now long enough. It's now as long as the input sentence, so I should be done. So here in the study, an encoder-decoder model without attention is being used. And the question is, does the encoder record the length of the consumed sequence, and does the decoder record the length of the generated sequence? And this is now basically a correlation question. Is there a particular neuron? How well does it correlate with this particular property? So we compute the correlation between the value of the neuron when processing the X word and the position X. And we are successful if a highly correlated neuron works. So here is one neuron and another neuron that seems to be correlated highly with the length of the sentence. So while the encoding phrase kind of decreases in value, so it goes all the way to -17 or so, and then when we decode, it goes back up. And here you see what it does in terms of impacting the prediction that the end of sentence token should be generated, and that seems to be generally low until the very end. Okay, and that's it for today. And we actually reached the end of the textbook at this point, and the next two lectures are gonna be some bonus topics. One is on parallel corpus mining, and the very, very last one on computer-aided translation.